This is Hannibal here from the Hannibal TV on YouTube. We are also on the Wicked Alien channel with
Giving
two-time.
Tuesday is a global effort.
Oh,
There we go.
anyways, I think we have some outside interference there, but Mean Gene Sticko here, two-time author of UAP related books, and we're going to get into his latest one. He's also seen the Disclosure Project, it's called, or Age of Disclosure.
Age of disclosure,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I was too cheap to spend the $25, so he's going to give me and anyone else that hasn't seen it the breakdown because he's watched it. But I just want to say one thing about that. If they're so passionate about disclosure and they want people not interested in UAPs to watch this, what kind of a person that's skeptical about UAPs or not interested in it is going to actually watch this and pay $25? But how are you doing today, sir?
Yeah, I'm
Former
doing good.
former Air Force, I forgot to mention.
Yeah, no, I'm doing good. It's been geez, it's probably been a month and a half since we've been on together. So good to see you again. Been keeping up on the wrestling stuff, and you did a good interview there with Avi Loeb. So you've kept things running.
Yeah, I've done a couple of them, but I'm kind of at the point now where we're hearing so much contradictory stuff about the Three Eye Atlas. I just kind of want to wait and see what happens at this point because it kind of gives me a headache
Yeah.
hearing all the arguing. Where at this point, it's like I'm not really convinced by either one. At this point, it's just like put up or shut up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people ask me about it all the time, and I'm like, I really am at the point of it's like, so what? I hope whoever has a vested interest in it, whoever, you know, I hope it delivers whatever they need it to deliver, right? So if we need it to be, or someone needs it to be a unusual interplanetary object that science is going to learn something from, I think that's great. If it's the other end of the spectrum, from what I heard, somebody remote viewed it and saw 5 million reptilian aliens cryogenically frozen in a mothership. I'm good with that too. Whichever one, we just gotta land on one, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm actually hoping myself it's more on the NASA end that it's a regular comet because I don't want to be spot. I don't see anything good that could eventually come out of us getting spied on. We hear people talking about that dark forest concept that if you're in a dark forest, you don't necessarily want to be noticed
Yeah.
coming out of it because it could be a bad thing. But but I do find NASA very arrogant in their press conference, and it is funny. I will agree with Avi Loeb on this. The picture that they waited something like 8 weeks to hold wasn't even that good, and I don't believe that that was the best picture that they have.
Yeah. I mean, it just, and again, it just feeds into all the criticism of, not just NASA as an agency, but yeah, the transition that, well, now it's a spy agency. Well, it feeds into the, do they do stuff just to keep, this UAP narrative, UFO narrative alive that really isn't, is just a cover up for other advanced technology and things like that. So yeah, they didn't do anybody or themselves any favors with that photo. I mean, it was really disappointing.
And then we've had people like Paul Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada, and Edgar Mitchell say that NASA knows a lot more about what's going on. But if they are a spy agency, they wouldn't be legally allowed to tell us, anyways, right? They would be telling us a different story.
Well, exactly. I mean, I guess that sort of leads into the whole age of disclosure and both the content itself and the outcome of it, or the review, the many reviews. And like everything Hannibal, half the people love it and take it for what it is, and the other half think it's a psyop.
And where do you stand on it? Or and it could be a bit of both as well. From the research I've been doing, it seems like definitely there have been cases where various branches of governments have pretended to be extraterrestrials, not necessarily to us, but to other countries who have at least planned it. So at various points, there could have been psyops according to various documentation that has come
Yeah.
out over the years.
I mean, I think like everything, the truth's always somewhere in the middle, right? The facts are skewed on either side. Is it a pure psyop? I don't see it that way. I don't see it necessarily as that while there are psyop elements you can relate to, it's kind of a overuse and overgeneralization of the term. So what's my review of it? Listen, I think it's number one, it is it wasn't made for the community. It wasn't made for everybody who already believes and already knows the, in-depth histories and have lived through this on a day-to-day basis, right? This is for the general public. This is I would look at it on the one hand as just sort of being a timestamp and a consolidation of all of those government positions, right? So if you look at, the psyop aspect of it, yes, definitely, it even says it in the disclaimers at the beginning, right? These people are talking about the things that they can talk about. They're talking about the aspects of this issue that essentially the government has said, yes, go ahead and talk about it. So, it comes down to, has the government approved this narrative and the things that everybody has said because they're trying to conduct the psyop to protect something else? Or is it part of this managed, narrative control disclosure, as I like to call it, transition by design, that they are just, it is part of the step that's allowing everything to go down that path.
Yes,
Oh,
many people are talking about that. Like, is this actually controlled disclosure? Because there's so many government people involved in the production of this. Is this part of the government's plan of disclosure? And what do you think about the producer going on all these shows saying that he believes that Trump is planning on making some type of response to the movie? I don't actually know if the demand from the public is that big where he's going to have to make a response on it so far, but that's what the producer's kind of hinting at. There might be a some type of statement.
yeah, and I don't, again, I don't think it necessarily has to be that big with the public. It is a stepping stone in the process, right? So, what people call disclosed or controlled disclosure, I've said as a term of art in the intelligence community, that is a term of art. It's a thing that you do, controlled disclosure. That has become saturated because of the information age that we live in, and the videos and communication and all of those reasons. They can't control that narrative anymore. And that's why I've been pushing the phrase out, transition by design. They now have to walk a path that takes logical steps. So, does it need to win an Academy Award? Does it need to be the number one bestseller? I saw somebody be like, oh, well, it's number 48 on Amazon, if you want it to be monumental. No, it doesn't necessarily have to be. It just has to have a place in the historical record. And so you have, prior to this, the rolling out of the people who worked in the programs, your Lou Elizanos and Jay Strattons and everybody else, who have come out and talked about it. You have the legislative branch, your Marco Rubio's formerly as a senator, now sitting as, acting national security advisor and secretary of state. We've had Tulsi Gabbard, we've had J.D. Vance, we've, to some degree, on the campaign trail at least, you had Trump talking about it. You've had, Bush Jr., Clinton, and Obama saying things about it. But again, it's not official. until it comes from the person sitting in the chair in the Oval Office on what exactly the government policy and position is. So all of those things, the the transition of NASA to an extent, the willingness of agencies to begin talking more about it. You saw not too long ago the FBI put out their directive about, government employees reporting UAP through the system that they have. So you see this institutional integration of the UAP issue. We're starting to see our allies, UK, Brazil, Canada to an extent. You're starting to see them replicate this. France, if you're not aware, has a phenomenal reporting system that is a public-private partnership with one of the academic institutions there on keeping all the UAP data or collecting all the data and keeping it public. So, this looks more like a coordinated transition and a coordinated rollout of what exactly, this is all about, which then begins to open the doors for an Oval Office type action. And so, yeah, I don't think, as I said, it needs to be, the number one Amazon Prime film. But what can happen, and my assessment, the logical next step, if Trump wants to do something, is to form a presidential commission. And it's the only really politically expedient and frankly responsible way to respond to it. So he can come out and say, okay, we've got the House, we've got the Senate. They can't come to terms and agreements on this. We've got the public asking questions about it. We have, mistrust in the government. And, he's been trying to position the administration as, champions of transparency overall. So the responsible thing to do would say, I'm going to form a bipartisan commission. And, perhaps it's some of these, the House members that sit on it, perhaps some of the whistleblowers. And certainly he brings in people from the academic community who can then sit down and say, okay, what are the exact barriers that we have when it comes to oversight? What is the public information that we have and have already declassified? What can we still declassify that adds to that? And he can also address the whistleblower protections. And the commission itself couldn't enact whistleblower protections, but then it goes back to Congress to say, as a result of this, here are the things that are recommended. And so that begins to push through some of the challenges you have, like from Mike Rounds and people who are somewhat funded by, what I started calling the UAP industrial complex, who might be the roadblocks to that. I think the commission opens the door to it. The findings from that commission then allow this Oval Office speech to say, hey, it's not just me as president, da da da. These are the findings of the commission, and the commissions have found, yes or no, this is what we've got.
Now I understand in this, I think it's Eric Davis said that there was two types of non-human intelligence we're aware of. In the past, he has said there were three, but what kind of detail did they go into about what they know about the types of NHI in this movie?
Not a whole lot, and that's why I say I think they tried to keep they tried to stay within some guardrails, right? Because again, we're not the audience for it. So it was very much around the issue, how Lou, Jay Stratton, and others, got involved in it, the concerns, the safety aspects, the just the general right of the public to know, and oversight, and all of that. And it was well supported by the statements that everybody they interviewed made. And so they went through not just that we have it, we're not alone. They touched on the biologics. They focused a bit, more on Grush's testimony, but they didn't. I think it was Davis that went. He talked a little bit more about the types of alien civilizations, but they just touched on it. I mean, again, I think it was a very smart film, in the sense that, even if you so long as you're just not a no, this isn't real, total debunker, totally against it. But I think for the average person who's like, okay, I'm open minded to this, what have you got? I think what they presented was realistic and reasonable enough, and they structured their statements and arguments in that way that it wasn't going to turn somebody off suddenly, because, like, oh, now they're up. Listen, there's even a lot of it that turns me off when people start going down certain roads where it's like, you know, again, I don't discount it, but let's just keep our arms around the things we can keep our arms around right now, right? Let's not try to force everybody to think, or to assess this, drink through a fire hose, as they say. And I think within the community, that's part of the problem, right? Everybody wants everyone to drink through the water hose, ram it all down your throat. Everything in every aspect of this, and everything everybody says about it is real and 100%. The crafter conscious, their telepathy, with human. Listen, let's take it step by step, right?
Right.
Reel it in, control the fucking excitement a little bit. Let's let's help everybody digest this, because there is a lot of information. And then let's deal with the facts as they come out, and the science or the findings or whatever it is. Let's deal with those as they come out, because I think the fighting aspect of this is never going to end, because people are convinced of what they're convinced of. And I'm one to go by the don't necessarily believe everything you think. Be ready to have perhaps what you've concluded challenged, right? Expect it might not be as sexy as you think it's going to be, in a lot of ways. But it's, my overall review, I think it was a fine movie. Don't think it was a psyop. I think it certainly has a role in being a step in the path forward, a catalyst, let's say, that was probably needed, that we can focus on one central body of work that captures all of the things involving government and science at this point, that then lays a foundation for going forward.
And when you mentioned the step in the right direction, it did get a lot of news coverage, and overall, they weren't making fun of it. There wasn't as much X-Files music when they're talking about it. They're taking the stories seriously. They might not be acknowledging that it's NHI, but they're acknowledging that it's something unusual.
Yeah,
But
and I think one of the more important things, they're repeating the point of it, or they're repeating the talking points, in so much as being definitive. We are not alone. There are objects that the government does not know the origins of. So yeah, I think the press and the mainstream media has been useful in that way. Dan Farrer making the rounds, yeah, that's great. It's great they had him. And just to backtrack, what you said about the $25, $25 price tag to buy it, or $19 price tag to rent it, especially if you're trying to get, that mainstream audience to engage somebody that, might not otherwise be interested, but would, stream it if it happened to be on and it was already part of the package. I'd imagine at one point it's going to get there. Um, but listen, yourself, you've done films. Nothing's cheap. And so you've got to recover that somewhere, somehow. So I don't necessarily fault them. I know my understanding is, Dan Farr was hoping for a nationwide, every theater having this thing, and the industry just wasn't going for it. So again, truth always being somewhere in the middle, where they landed as far as the limited release in a few theaters, perhaps that'll expand to other smaller theaters, niche theaters, maybe see the price of it come down, or it just go into the regular rotation. Um, it's the great compromise anyone in business winds up having to make to ensure their shit gets out there.
Yes. I just the way they talk about it like it would be an immediate change. I'm just use my parents as an example who don't believe in any of this. I would have to literally drag them in front of a TV and force them to watch it. So I don't know if that many people that aren't interested are going to tune into it, but some might, and maybe that's going to grow over time. But one thing I think that they talked about in this that I've heard is in the past, a lot of the community out there says, oh well, they're like stopping us from playing with matches as far as turning off and on our nukes. But I understand, and maybe you can elaborate on this. In the movie they tell a different story, that no, this wasn't a good thing when they turned off and on our nukes. Could you explain what they discussed?
Yeah, so they gave a couple, they talked about in the Russia instance that the countdown was initiated and Russia wasn't able to stop that countdown. They talked about the taking the systems down. All the stories we're already familiar with. Um, and so yeah, they didn't frame it so much in the way of, oh, they're trying to send us a message to be peaceful. It was very much framed in the way of, are they, could they be trying to cause war between nations and things like that. It was a little, I'd say, yeah, a little more nefarious um, sounding than perhaps a lot of us have generally assessed it to be more of a warning to nations. And that was one thing I found interesting continuously through the documentary, and when these things came up, and they talked a lot about reverse engineering, which of course I have a very deep interest in. Um, it's always this go-to on the weaponization and the concerns on the weaponization of the technology. And I know some other organizations talk about, how do we again bring this forward for peaceful purposes? Does it need to be rolled into the UN space accords and for the peaceful use of outer space? Though we're probably far beyond that. Um, but it put things like the UAP Disclosure Act and the desire for the government to have eminent domain over the materials, to be able to go back into the companies and be like, nope, all right, now you got to give them back, or this is what we're going to do with them. That was touched upon. I could see a lot of certainly complications from that. But yeah, I always find it interesting. It's right to the weaponization aspect of it that and so I don't know where we get, or we need that mindset change to say, well, can't we get governments to start looking at this as, you know, prosperity of humanity, right? See the benefits of that first, instead of going straight to weaponization. But again, if we take this back into the 30s, 40s, post World War II mindsets, then it makes sense. That's why we are where we are today with it. And it is all about the weaponization of the technology, because it's just been carried over, from the Cold War.
And you will have some people like Peter Levenda, who recently did an interview with Jesse Michaels, talking about that it might have been NHI that caused us to go against each other in the first place through potentially creating the concepts of religion, which has led to a lot of our wars. But there's theories out there too that they're the ones that have been making us battle for whatever reason.
Yeah, and and again, I tend to not agree with that, and it's just totally, trying to follow a line of logic. I think the whole development of religion, if we go back into the ancient aliens ideas, and that there was much closer and more regular interaction, I could see more of a scenario where they're bouncing around, they're doing their things with all the civilizations, and then they're like, all right, now we're gonna leave everybody their own devices. And they're like, Gene, you're in charge here, Hannibal, you're in charge over there, right? Now I'm trying to keep the people together and pass on this learning, and the people start acting up. I'm like, oh, hold on, I am the representative of the gods here on earth, right? And so now I've got to convince people of that. So I start dressing, I start behaving, I start doing things that might have make me look more like them. Um, and then somebody says, "Yeah, well, okay, Gene, but Hannibal over here, he says he's the one." Okay, well now I'm gonna, well, no, let's go fight about it, right? And then Hannibal kicks my ass, and then everyone said, "Oh, obviously Hannibal's the one who they want to be in charge," and it cascades, 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 and all of a sudden the cultural and institutional memory goes away, and we have the writings and ceremonies and traditions and symbolisms of these things that remain, that just continue to get perverted, generation after generation. So yeah, I'm just probably on the other side of that theory, that it's intentional. I think it was just a matter of our DNA, and the basic animal instincts of survival of the fittest, and perhaps they've just been sitting back watching that.
So apparently they talked a lot about the at least 80-year cover up of NHI. Could you go into what they discussed related to the cover up and how, which is the big question that a lot of people have a hard time grasping, how has every country in the world that can't agree on anything, how have they agreed to keep this a secret? That's a big thing that a lot of people don't understand.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's interesting because you're right in the one sense. It's like, of all the things, if there's going to be a cover up, this is the one thing everybody's agreed on. Um, but when you step back and you begin to look at it sort of in the geopolitical sense, now what Russia says about it is much different than the United States. Just to take or we take the big three: US, China, and Russia, right? So China essentially says nothing, and they just push out new technology, right? And they don't try to have or offer any explanation or have any discussions about UAPs. They're structured in such a way they can do that. Russia was too, up until the fall of the Soviet Union, and for the brief period between 93, 94, and then Putin becoming president in 2000, right? And that's the window where most of what we got came out of Russia. But Russia's never pretended that UFOs are perhaps US technology. Russia's always been like, no, we don't know what it is. We've formed a commission and an organization to study it, and blah blah. Now, post Putin, that's changed a little bit, where they sort of just like China, ignore the UAP aspect of it when it comes out. And where they can't ignore it, then they just outright blame the United States. But again, that 50s 50s through well, yeah, into the 90s even, and up until the fall, they would very much differentiate, UAP from, known US technology. Um, when it comes to other countries, even like the UK, let's say, again, you have to look at the influence of the US, right? We have military bases in the UK. We have more resources and capacity to deal with recovered technology. And so, therefore, we become the default. It's what happened in Brazil, right? It was beyond what they could do. So, what did they do? They call the US. The US says, great. They send a C5 or C-130 down there to start picking up pieces, and all of a sudden it's in our ecosystem instead. So, I think inevitably any nation that might have their hands historically on the technology would have defaulted to either the US, Russia, or China, whoever, with which they're allied, for that assistance. And that would have driven whatever secrecy, they have on it, would have been dictated by the necessity of having those relationships. And then how do you manage that? You manage it financially, right? Great, we're going to take this, we're going to exploit it and all the rest of it. And there's going to be another, 100 million in your budget for science and technology and universities and shit down the road. Just keep your mouth shut.
Now, since we're talking about Russia, I recently was listening to one of Jacques Vallée's audiobooks, and he was talking about the Voronezh, I think I'm saying it right, UAP incident, which is one of the best documented incidents in history in Russia, where a craft landed in a public park. Beings came out. There were scientists that took samples of the ground. Police covered it. The military were there. I believe it happened in 1989.
Yeah.
So just before the cell phone era. What do you know about that, if anything? I know you're more into the reverse engineering, but this is a pretty interesting thing. 9 foot tall aliens.
Yeah, and again, it's very well documented, and the documents that have come out of the from that period, the former KGB files and all that, are very detailed. And again, these are credible people, right? They're military officers, they're scientists, um, and contextually in the period, it would certainly, you as an average person, never mind, a government employee, someone who had one of those nice cushy government Soviet era jobs, you are not going to risk that to just make some stuff up. um and again, there you can play devil's advocate on myself. The disinformation aspect of it, could it have been some other technology landed there and they said, okay, everybody, no, it's so they crashed some sort of test object, and they told everybody, no, everybody write a statement now about UFOs and this and that. Excuse me. Yes, it's possible. But again, you know, when you read these things, particularly, in the native languages, they don't come across as contrived. I mean, I've read enough witness statements in my past life and my career that you can tell when somebody's struggling to make up a story in writing as it goes along. Um, and you can tell when there's corroboration, before they start taking statements of things that people say in the areas. In a particular section of it, let's say everybody says something the exact same way or even just close enough. I mean, there's just a you can just tell those things, and none of that comes across in those witness statements that it would fall like that.
Very interesting. As far as what they talked about in the movie, The Age of Disclosure, with your, in regards to your area of expertise, reverse engineering, is there anything that stood out to you?
No, well, again, it was kind of nice to hear confirmation. It confirmed a lot of things for me, right? So it confirmed, they talked in terms of, oh, we suspect um, that other countries, Russia is reverse engineering, is attempting to. They weren't so definitive on it, um, except for particularly the US. Yes, there were programs. Yes, there's reverse engineerings. We suspect Russia has the same. Um, I think that's again sort of narrative control, that's sort of tiptoeing the geopolitical consequences of somebody in a government official coming right out and saying, yes, we know Russia does this and that. That has much different implications than me saying it, than even a Jay Stratton or Lou Elizondo saying it. For a sitting member or even a former member of Congress to make a statement in such a definitive way has much different political consequences. Um, again, they didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but it certainly, as I'm sitting there thinking, well, you definitely have that. And I know they have this. And, I know what my father-in-law did. Um, I just look at it and never mind, this was filmed 2 years ago, right? So, 50, Lou Elizondo's 50 pounds heavier in it. Um, as we go forward, I sent him a text during it saying, boy, they weren't kidding. The camera puts 10 pounds on you. And he's like, yeah, I wasn't, real healthy back then. I said, well, probably also under a lot of stress during that period too. Um, but yeah, so I think, right now I just try to keep it or look at it for what it's worth. It is a stepping stone, a consolidated stepping stone of all of the different things we have available at this time. They've packaged it up in the hopefully for the purpose of this going forward.
What does Lou Elizondo drink, by the way? You were out with him a couple weeks ago.
Well, what did he have? I think he just had. Oh, you know what? He had wine. Yeah,
Wine. Okay.
I was
Fancy.
making fun
He's
of
a
him because
fancy guy.
I drink old fashions, and the more exotic the old fashioned. We went out to dinner, my wife and I. She had a rehearsal for an upcoming show she's got concert, and we went to dinner afterwards. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I'm going to have my old fashioned, and then they were like, oh, we have this smoked fig and she said old fashioned. I said, that's it, sold. Any variation thereof, I'll take.
So I understand he was partly a producer in this movie. They at least they talked about him having some role in producing it. What did he exactly present in the movie?
So he was pretty much like the narrator for a good portion of it. He sort of set the stage, not only about his story. I've seen online people making fun of the one section. They have a giant chalkboard with the five observables, but it's really the five observables plus one of UAP.
Yeah, isn't there
Um,
seven now?
I
I
don't know
think
if
they
they've
may have
added
even
added the
added.
seventh. The sixth one though was really about the biological impact on people who've spent time with it. So there are some new faces that appear in the show or in the documentary, and particularly around this issue of people who have spent time close to these UFOs, having radiation burn, cancers, real physical impacts. to their lives. So it was a short part of it, but I think it was also an impactful part of it. Um, and it made me think a lot too about the CE5 people and the dog whistle guy and everybody that wants to kind of call them down. Um, and thinking to myself, oh yeah, you're going to call them down, you're going to wind up with radiation burns or some sort of weird cancer or some shit because of it. And I even, and it makes sense because I even related to my military experience. Every couple of years, I'll get updates through the VA about,
Those are
uh,
the 5 observables, by the way. To the Stars hasn't updated
yep,
theirs yet, just so people know.
yeah. So, you have those, then we're, written out on a chalkboard and he kind of underlines them as he goes through each one. And then he has the sixth one, this, the biological effects that's added to it. Um, he talks about somewhat, I guess, I'm seeing it's becoming controversial. He talks about information that he had that there was a discussion among some group of 27 about whether he should be killed, him and Jay Stratton, or, should be assassinated. He doesn't go into much detail about it. They talk about the offices that might have been involved, but they frame the cover up as belonging to this legacy program. So I'm thinking maybe that's the new name of is it the Majestic 12 or whatever it might be. But essentially, this apparatus within government, who are the ones who really maintain the progress and continuity of UAP research and interactions, whatever it is that they're doing in that, and controlling the narrative. And it's allegedly headed up by the CIA with the Department of Energy and the Air Force as the sub organizations to it. And it's within this legacy program where the deepest, darkest secrets are kept. Marco Rubio talks about even the president is kept out of the loop as a matter of plausible deniability, and how this group really are career bureaucrats who look at anybody in an elected position, including Congress, including the president, as just temporary employees who don't have a need to know all the details on what this is.
And I understand Ryan Graves was in that too. I don't know how much you're allowed to say, but you've been having some personal talks with Ryan Graves as well lately. Can you
Yeah,
get?
no, nothing too deep. I met him once last weekend, 2 weekends ago. So we've got so our Wicked Alien Radio Boston group, which is made up of some of the podcasters in the area, and just trying to really bring a focus to there's so much like history in New England on UFOs and UAPs that are some great stories, and it's embedded here. So that's sort of the purpose of the Wicked Local brand, is to amplify not only the podcasters and our friends like you and others who are looking at the area, but bring it back to a New England focus too. And so we have a meetup group, and Ryan joined us for the meetup group. So spent a couple of hours with him and the folks who came out, and really just got. So we didn't go really into too much detail about anything. I was supposed to go be in New York City yesterday for the Q&A session, well, to watch the documentary and the Q&A session, and so I was hoping I'd see him again there, but I didn't want. I'm under the weather now. I'm on some new medications, so a drive to New York City and trying to stay overnight there was not it was not an attractive proposition for me, so I wound up skipping it.
As far as the movie, how did it compare to like Stephen Greer's documentaries? There's a clear bias and narrative that he wants you to go by, and even James Fox, he has his own ideas of what he wants you to grasp out of his movies. Was this more neutral, and here's the information, make your own decisions, or was it pushing you to buy something or to accept a particular narrative?
Yeah, I can't. And I've seen some chatter about that, and again, in the context of is it a psyop? So if there's a message to come out of it, the message is there are UAPs, there are UFOs, there are NHI. These things are real, they exist. They're interacting with us. We don't know what it is. So, if that's a psyop, that's, if there is a narrative that's being pushed, that's purely the narrative that I could really take out of it. Um and overall, and there's need, and the American people need to have a right to know it, and there needs to be oversight, particularly of the contractors and people who are involved in developing this technology, because if it is at this the new atom bomb age type weaponization, then that certainly should be transparent to the public, transparent amongst our allies, the nations of the world as responsible global citizens and partners, and that private industry should not have control over these materials exclusively without any sort of oversight.
And that is fair, and that is interesting, and that's what I'm interested in. So it's good to know. And I like your points about the people that are saying that they're summoning these things, and there is harmful effects, like the famous story of the guy shining a spotlight at a UAP, and then it shines something down and blinds him.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like, if if there is, if we, and I've gone through this, I've thought on it so many times, um about this idea. So does the government truly not know? Do they know that none of it's a threat? Do they know some of it's a threat but they can't differentiate? um Again, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. There's probably some combination of it. But, as far as, yeah, the average Joe trying to be like, hey, come down here and land and let's have a talk. I don't necessarily know if that's a, a smart thing to, do. Because I also say, if the aliens have a message for humanity, and they can do things telepathically, then I'm sure they would figure out exactly who these messages need to go to and who needs to be talked to get it out to the widest population possible, and not just, the random potato farmer in, southern Ukraine somewhere.
I hear they did talk about the infamous Holloman Air Force Base landing, where apparently beings met with CIA and members of the military. What was that, back in the 50s or 60s? I forget exactly when, but it's been a while, and there's been a lot of credible people that have said that there has been direct contact, which is very interesting. But what do you make of that, and what did they present about that landing in the movie?
Yeah, so I remember them talking about it, but I really don't. Nothing stood out to me. So again, it was probably just repeating the story, and I sort of passed over it mentally. But yeah, it's like every listen. Even when I was in the service, and I knew guys who were out in Tonopah, Area 51, and all that, and they would some of them would say the same thing. Well, I can't talk about what I've seen, but yeah, there's some weird shit. One kid said, "Oh, he's like, yeah, I know that we, have recovered bodies and we've returned bodies back to their people, their people. That there's an open channel of communication somehow." Y- You know, okay, it's I can't, not gonna totally say it's bull or anything, or it wouldn't surprise me. I guess is where I land on it. It's like, okay, it wouldn't surprise me. There's no proof of it. Um, it hasn't changed anything in my day-to-day life, it seems, unless you want to count all the technology that I'm sitting around that seems to make it more complicated than easy. But
Yeah, and Jim Semivan has also alluded to that. The one of the former high ups in the CIA who also works for To the Stars, that he would assume that there has been contact. But one interesting person, I don't know if you saw Jim Lukatsky on the
yep,
Weaponized podcast, and he was supposedly in charge of one of the UAP legacy programs. He said the most interesting thing I heard him say on this is that if the public knew what I knew about what we're capable of after doing these reverse engineering programs, we would not be concerned about invading civilizations. So basically, hinting that our technology and ability to defend ourselves against potential visitors is much greater than we have any idea about.
yeah, and so again, I'd take that with a grain of salt, and only in so much as well, if they were that advanced to begin with, let's not get too cocky that we can take them down. My own research that I've done based on my father-in-law's work, right? Taking the craft that he describes and engineered in that, I found 6 government programs that could counter that craft. So it certainly looks like we've done work, at least, based on this small piece that I have. Um, Certainly looks like we've done work to figure out how to counter this type. Obviously, there's multiple types. So again, how big these programs are, what are the most common denominator between all the different types of craft, and have they developed some sort of countermeasures for those most common elements, would sort of makes the most sense to me.
And when I listened to it's an over 2 hour interview with the director on Joe Rogan, the most interesting part of that interview was when he was talking about programs that they had decades ago, and they even referenced this Operation Starfish Prime, where they were blowing up nuclear bombs in space as well as underwater. And it may not have just been for nuclear testing, it may have been because there's stuff under there that we actually wanted to knock out. Because it sounds really, even though that was what, 80 years ago, 60
Right.
years ago, you got to know that's not very smart. Maybe there
No.
was a reason to risk doing that, that they actually did want to knock certain things out. Who knows?
Yeah.
But they
Yeah,
talked
quite
about it.
possible. I mean, again, I think the big takeaway is this idea of there's obviously something going on. There's obviously a much richer history than anyone has admitted to. Um, and so what becomes the responsible path forward? You know, we can I think if we have that foundation laid, where more and more documentation can come out, more structures put. I think the trick is putting the structure in place that manages it going forward before we worry too much about the what was done in the past and the decisions that were made in the past, right? So we can't change any of that, and if we're talking over the course of 80 years, how many people are still left to quote unquote hold accountable, you know, for anything? So, all those are all things that'll have to be flushed out and worked out in a way, again, that just allows us to move forward here. That's, my personal hope.
Maybe we should all start sitting out in our backyards with a case of beer, a rifle, and a cell phone like the guy we interviewed the other week.
I do that
Goodness.
anyway. Yeah, or John, right?
Yeah.
John Bell. No, exactly. I mean, it's again, it's an interesting time, and I just try to tell people, listen, you gotta there's a difference between information and intelligence, right? There's a difference between information and evidence, and not everything is evidence. Some, and things have to be broken down. And all I can say is just keep your arms around the things you can keep your arms around. Be supportive of everybody trying to doing the work to bring the issue forward, whether you particularly like them as a person or not. Sometimes we've got who we've got, so let's get behind them. And instead of being demanding, let's try to find the things that allow quick wins, that allow easy wins, right? And it's somewhat what when I push forward, the work and the things that I have. I understand there's complications around them, and you can't just throw them out there at a Senate hearing and all the rest of it. Great, but let's look at a path forward. What do we need to do? How do we get there? How do we make it easy, not only for the politicians that have got to get this out, but the institutions that have to manage how things that have to manage the fallout. And I've talked about it before, right? And it's one of the big concerns. The ontological shock, the religious shock is, it starts making everybody question, or it makes people more fanatical. And I think we saw some of that. And they talk about that in the documentary too, Hannibal, is that there were people going up to Jay Stratton and the likes saying, these are demons. You guys are doing the devil's work. And they were sort of taken back and shocked at the religious extremism they were getting for trying to talk about this issue. So we can magnify that however many times on sort of what the reaction is going to be out of the public if the institutions aren't on board with all of this, or understand the impacts of the path forwards in it.
And another impact that I think the governments worry about, and I've heard people like Jacques Vallée talk about this, is if there's something above the government that could potentially have more control over us than the government, they're concerned that the people might not find the government as powerful. So that is apparently one reason against disclosure, from what I understand.
Yeah, but in the same way, the mechanisms have to be there, right? So you can certainly have a break off faction who says, "Oh, I'm just going to wait for instructions from the Galactic Empire. I'm going to go Galactic Federation. I'm going to go sit in the woods, or sit on the mountaintop." Well, you're going to get hungry and you're going to want plumbing eventually. So unless the Galactic Federation is going to come down on that and start providing that for you, then the government that you have might be the best bet to kind of work with so far. And believe me, I'm one who always sits back and says, remember, the government is just us, right? They don't inherently know anything more than we do. They're not inherently smarter or anything than the average. They are simply the representatives we have elected to go work this stuff out for us while we go about having our daily lives, right? We have said, I don't want to drive down to Washington D.C. to cast a vote on all of these issues, and it's impractical to try and have 300 million people drive down to D.C. to cast a vote. So we're going to send somebody there to represent us. So if we kind of, again, we need to be in that mind frame, and we need to constantly check our representatives to make sure they keep that mind frame as well. We have not elected them to hold power over us. We have elected them to represent us amongst our other fellow Americans in these bodies that have been set up. That didn't come with having power over us.
That makes sense. There was someone on here that wanted you to tell a UAP story. Well, you have a new book coming out December the 9th. What can you tell us about that?
So this is the origins story. Um, yeah, so this is the book I always wanted to write, and I probably started trying to write this back around 2010, 2011. Ran into a number of issues trying to do it at first. Struggled with, what is it exactly I want to talk about in it, and because I've got like so many great little stories to tell. Oh, and I see that some of my UFO. I don't have any UFO stories. I mean, this dropped on me because my father-in-law sent me his UFO reverse engineering work, and that's my story. But this book, Unconventional, is the exposing how big oil works within the national security apparatus, within the cooperative arrangements with governments and intelligence agencies and the military, how we all work together so that when you're standing there at the gas pump pumping in your gas, so you don't have to think about all the really bad shit that went into getting that to happen. And so it's about 400 pages. It covers not only everything from a high level, but I talk about my individual experiences, um, uh, hurricane, in Europe, and Russian mafia and black market fuels, Hurricane Katrina and Rita in 2005, the impacts that had and the operations behind that. I go into Iraq, getting oil companies back into Iraq, what happens in places like Nigeria, my own experiences in Pakistan after the Bin Laden assassination, when we
Have you
had
been to Nigeria, by the way?
oh, I spent a lot of time in
Oh,
Nigeria. Yeah,
good.
I've,
No
I've been.
wonder you've had some issues with your health going to places like that.
Oh yeah, no, no, any place that ends in stan, outside of the only place I haven't been is actually Afghanistan. But Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia. I was in for almost 4 months. Iraq, Libya, most of North Africa, um, Africa itself. A lot of time in Nigeria, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, Madagascar. So
That's when you were in the Air Force?
no, that's why I was. That's why I was doing intelligence in the oil and gas industry.
Okay,
In the
interesting.
Air Force, I was in I had served in Bosnia during the conflict there when with NATO, and I was running the ambassador in and out during that time. What else? So I still had Desert Storm, Southern Watch, so Saudi Arabia, Bosnia, Somalia. Um, but yeah, everything else was oil and gas related, but still worked a lot with the military, throughout all those years. So yeah, unconventional is just that, just that the story of, and I titled it that, and there's a couple of quotes because around the time I was getting into that part of the business and in that world, the term for the end of easy oil, where you just kind of, some places you could put a pitchfork in the ground and oil would come up. Well, now they had to start thinking of new ways like fracking and shale and horizontal drilling and what they call unconventional techniques. So I was sort of birthed in that whole era of the end of easy oil, and certainly the geopolitics, the security of it became unconventional as well, which is why I landed on that title.
Well, I'll get one last question in for you before you go. What did you think of Dan Farrow overall, the director slash producer of The Age of Disclosure?
Yeah, I mean, again, the only opinions I have is based on the presentations that I saw in his interviews and such, and he did a fine job representing it. I know there's behind the scenes, there's some controversies, or there's some negative opinions of him and all of that. So I don't know. I don't have any insights into any of that part of it, but I think he did a fine job, as he should, representing his own film. And, I think he was good as far as his messaging and keeping it consistent and keeping it in those guardrails of, what the film actually is and what it actually isn't. And, we'll just see going forward how what kind of voice, if any, he becomes in all of this.
And there's always going to be negative stuff coming out when you have a big movie like that getting a lot of publicity. You're going to get haters, even if you're the best of people. I don't know much about him, but I did enjoy his podcast with Joe Rogan. I sat there
Yeah.
for the 2 hours and 6 minutes and found it very interesting. And hopefully, more and more information is going to come out, and we'll keep you updated here. But I'll let Mean Gene close this off for us. Make
No,
sure you
thanks.
give us a like on whatever platform you're watching this.
Yeah, absolutely. We try to push this out there, make as many people can see it. Hannibal, thank you as always. Appreciate everything you do and keeping things running. And yeah, like I said, I think personally, I think it's worth the rent. But just know going into it, you're probably not going to learn anything new if you're a long time fan of the subject. But listen, the holiday coming up, you might want to spend the $25 and have it on in the living room and force the relatives to watch it if they're ones giving you poach back, and hopefully that helps bring them helps inform them, let's say, uh, than just hearing it from you. I guess that's the message for the viewers at home, Hannibal.